Looking at step 3 of the graduation project. At this point, a little less than half of you are at the right stage in the process. So I have part 1 done. Let's say hypothetically I've gone through all of my motifs, and I'm giving you an example here of the Mad Libs type chart that helps organize your thoughts for that preliminary thesis statement. And the reason it's called a preliminary thesis statement is because it can change. As you do your research, you might discover that you're taking in more information that you could possibly fit into that thesis. So you want to maybe broaden that thesis a little bit more, or you want to narrow it down. So, for example, my personal example I have here is reading a broad genre and listening to a variety of media generates empathy in the individual by exposing them to a range of perspectives they may not experience in their everyday personal experiences. So I just read that out loud for the first time and realized I have the word experiences twice, so that's probably going to be something I definitely revise there. So then part 3, which is due on Sunday, I think, or Monday, this is where I'm taking the notes from those first several resources that I've already done in step 1 and step 2. I think at this point we have 12 total resources, or should have 12. So what's important when I'm taking the notes is, 1, I need to make sure I'm citing them. That's why it says that right there, citing which source it's from. So you can keep that organized when you go to incorporate whatever your notes are. 2, you need to take as many notes as you can. It's better to have more than you'll need than not enough. So this is going to be a fairly lengthy process. And 3, I want to make sure that I am taking notes that are specific to my thesis statement. That's why it's important that I have that before I take the notes. So when and the reason I want to emphasize that is because as I was reading this particular article that I have side by side here, I kept finding myself being like, ooh, that's a really good point, and ooh, that's a really good point, but it had nothing to do with my thesis. So it's really important that as I'm going back through my sources, that I am staying on target with the notes that I take, that they're specific to my thesis. So I have a handful of notes here. I didn't go into a lot of depth for the example, but I have 2 sources that I was pulling from. One is this source, and you'll notice that I have one that's a full quote. Stories offer another way to step outside of oneself, and that's from this. So that's an actual quote, word for word, and you'll see those dots there, the ellipses. That means I have, in my note-taking process, taken parts of that sentence out, so I'm only focusing on those particular words. And then the second example from this, I only quoted a fragment, the rest is paraphrased. So there was a paper in 2013. Let me find it in my article. I wish I would have had that up a little bit sooner. Okay, so here we go. So this was the paragraph over here that kind of explains what this note is. So rather than quote that entire paragraph, I paraphrased, and I have 2013 paper, groups of people were told to read fiction, nonfiction, or not at all. Those who read fiction, and now is where I quote word for word, showed the most improvement on the empathy tests. So, and then Schmidt is where my citation. So when you're taking notes, you don't need to quote everything. In fact, you should only really quote things if the wording is extra powerful or very specific to your thesis. Otherwise, if you're using all quotes or word for word from your sources, you're going to really kind of jumble up your own natural writing voice, or speaking voice, as it were, since we're doing a presentation on this. Okay, so that's kind of important to remember when you're taking notes, that you need to, 1, cite where you're getting them from so you keep that organized. 2, decide when to quote, when not to quote, when to paraphrase. Okay, and make sure that you are, 3, staying on thesis. So you want to make sure your information that you're taking down is important to your thesis. So the note section up here is where I'm taking notes on all of my previous sources, As I get through that, I go to the final resource or research where I want to find some specific sources that are going to focus on my thesis and are going to definitely drive that home. So here you are going to do kind of all three. You're going to cite the source with all that bibliographical information, write a summary paragraph or annotation, and then you'll take those specific notes in that section. So this document is actually going to be fairly lengthy when you finish it, okay? So if you have started this process and after watching this think, oh goodness, I've been doing it wrong, quote unquote, this is not, I wouldn't delete anything, just keep it all organized. That way you can always go back and delete later, but it's harder to keep doing that Command Z or that undo button to get back to what you deleted. Okay, so once and the reason I'm going over this is so I can move on to what we're doing next week. Once I have that document completed, the next process is going to be organizing that. So I'll have all of these notes here, and then I will be kind of moving back and forth between when I take those notes into an outline that I'm going to be created. And I'm going to make a separate video for that so this doesn't get redundant. But what's important is to note that this is what we call a recursive process, which means once I finish, quote unquote, finish a step, that does not mean I'm done with it. I can always go back and add or change.